In 1874, a man was tied to a post in the center of a settlement and left there for 3 days. No trial, no appeal. The town watched. Nobody stepped in. What he had done was steal a bag of flour, and what was done to him was completely, entirely legal. Welcome to Mystery Wild West. And what you're about to hear is not the version most people know. If this kind of history actually tells you something real, subscribe. We go deeper here than most. Have you ever read about a punishment from this era and thought, how was that ever allowed? Tell us in the comments. Because the answer is more disturbing than you'd expect. This was the Wild West, and punishment was not about justice. It was about control, about fear, about making sure every man within 20 miles understood exactly what would happen if he stepped out of line. The law was thin out here. The land was enormous, and the men who held power used punishment the way others used fences, to mark what was theirs and keep everything else out. There were no oversight committees, no appeals courts with any real reach, no newspapers with correspondents stationed in remote settlements who might write something embarrassing. What existed was raw authority, and raw authority, when it goes unchecked long enough, finds the edges of what it can do, and then crosses them. These are 17 of those crossings. 17 punishments that were completely legal. Some were official policy. Some were the informal law of men with guns and no accountability. All of them happened. All of them shaped the world that the settlers, the miners, the farmers, and the drifters had to navigate every single day. Number 1, public flogging. A man walks into a mining camp with a grievance. He argues with the wrong person. Maybe he calls someone a liar in front of witnesses. By nightfall, he is face down against a wagon wheel, and the camp boss is holding a leather strap. 20 lashes, sometimes more. The crowd stands and watches. Some look away. Most don't. Flogging was not a relic of the past in the Wild West. It was common. It was practiced openly, and in many territories, it was not only permitted, it was encouraged. The logic was simple. Jails were expensive. Labor was needed. A man who could still work after his punishment was more useful than one locked in a cell. But here's the problem. There was no fixed number of lashes, no agreed limit. It depended entirely on the mood of the man holding the strap. 20 could become 40. 40 could become whatever the man doing the counting decided it was. And the person being counted had no recourse. The men who administered floggings in mining camps and on ranches were not officials in any formal sense. They were bosses, foremen, men who had been given authority over a workforce because they were willing to use it. The whip was part of that authority. It was expected. It was accepted, and in the absence of any mechanism to challenge it, it was used. A man who had been flogged returned to work the next day. The camp kept moving. The cargo kept loading, and everyone who had watched understood what they had seen. Not a punishment, but a demonstration, a message sent to 20 men at once at the cost of one man's back. Number 2, the pillory and the stocks. Picture a town square, if you could call it that. A patch of flat dirt between a saloon and a dry goods store. In the center, a wooden frame, a man's head and hands locked through the holes. He has been there since morning. It is now late afternoon. The sun has not moved in the way he needed it to. The stocks were used for public humiliation as much as punishment. Drunkenness, petty theft, disrespecting a town official. A man could be locked in for hours or for days, depending on who decided his sentence. Passers-by threw things, sometimes food, sometimes not food. What made it brutal was not just the physical discomfort, though that was real. Hours bent at the neck, arms fixed in place, no ability to shift or adjust. By the second hour, every position is wrong. By the sixth, nothing is tolerable. By the end of a full day, a man emerged stiff, dehydrated, sunburned, and humiliated in a way that lingered long after the wood was unlocked. In small settlements, everyone knew everyone. The shame lasted long after the structure was opened. The man who had been in the stocks walked into the saloon the following week and felt the gap, the slight pause, the redirected eyes, the conversation that stopped and restarted when he entered. He was marked, not by any physical mark, by the memory that a community shares once it has watched a man locked in place in the midday sun. Some men left after the stocks. They couldn't continue in a place where everyone had watched them. The settlement lost the person, but retained the lesson. That was often precisely the intended outcome. Number 3, branding. This one is not a rumor. It happened. A hot iron pressed against skin, usually the hand or the cheek, to mark a man permanently as a thief, a deserter, or worse. In some territories, branding was an official sentence handed down by a judge. In others, it was carried out by vigilante groups without any legal process at all. A branded man could not hide what he was. Every town he walked into, every employer he approached, every hand he extended, the mark was there. It followed him for the rest of his life. Employment was harder. Trust was harder. The most basic social transactions required managing the reaction to what was visible on his face or his hand. But it gets worse. In some cases, the wrong man was branded. Mistaken identity, false accusation, a grudge from someone with more influence. And once the iron touched skin, there was no correction, no apology that meant anything. A man could be exonerated of the crime for which he had been branded and still carry the mark into every room he entered for the rest of his life. The men who applied the iron often did it in public for the same reason that flogging was public. The lesson was for the audience, not just the recipient. A crowd that watched a branding watched it with the same attention they brought to any demonstration of authority. They understood what they were seeing. They filed it away, and they adjusted their behavior accordingly. Some adjusted by being more careful, some adjusted by being more compliant, some adjusted by putting enough distance between themselves and the men with the iron that the risk calculation changed. All of these outcomes served the interests of the men who held the branding iron. That was the point. Number 4. Chain gangs. A man convicted of vagrancy, which meant in many places simply not having visible employment, could be sentenced to work, not in a cell, on the road, in the heat, chained at the ankle to the man beside him, who was chained to the man beside him, moving slowly along a trail that needed clearing, or a ditch that needed digging. The guards were not required to be gentle. The work hours were not regulated. If a man collapsed, he was given water and told to stand up. If he couldn't stand, he was dragged to the side and left until he could. Chain gangs in the Wild West era were used not just as punishment, but as free labor. The territories needed infrastructure, roads, irrigation channels, foundations for buildings. Men sentenced to chain gang labor built much of what others later took credit for. The settlement that a prominent man described as his achievement, built on roads that men in irons had cleared, on foundations that chained hands had laid. Think about that for a moment. The roads some settlers praised as signs of civilization, built by men who had been convicted of being poor. The vagrancy laws that fed the chain gang system were not neutral. They were applied selectively to men who lacked the social connections or the resources to avoid them. A man who wandered between settlements without obvious employment was a candidate. A man who wandered between settlements and knew the right people was a traveler. The difference between those two categories was not behavior, it was relationships. And in the Wild West, relationships were everything. Number 5, hanging without a trial. Not the legal kind. The other kind. A rope thrown over a tree branch on the edge of town. A man dragged from wherever he was found. A crowd that had already decided the outcome before anyone spoke a word. Vigilante hangings were not rare. In certain periods and certain regions, they were almost routine. The justification was always the same. The law was too slow, too far away, or too corrupt to be trusted. So the community took matters into its own hands. A group of men, self-appointed, with varying levels of certainty about what they believed they knew. An accusation that had spread through the settlement faster than any investigation could have moved. A decision made in the charged atmosphere of collective anger, where the man who asked for restraint was outvoted by the men who wanted resolution. What the history books often skip is the error rate. Men were hanged on rumor, on accusation, on the word of someone who owed a debt or wanted a piece of land. There was no appeal. There was no morning after where someone could come forward with new information. The rope did not wait. And the community that had gathered to watch dispersed afterward into the same settlement, the same daily routines, carrying the weight of what they had done or witnessed. Some carried it heavily. Some didn't seem to carry it at all. Both were true, and both continued to live alongside each other in the same small space. Number 6, tar and feathering. It sounds almost comical until you understand what it actually involved. Heated tar, not boiling, but hot enough to cause serious burns, poured over a man's body. Then feathers dumped on top. Then the man paraded through the settlement on a rail, carried on the shoulders of whoever was doing the parading. This was not done in secret. It was done in daylight. It was done with an audience. It was done to humiliate, to injure, and to send a message to everyone watching. The message was, this is what happens to men like him. And the definition of men like him changed depending on who was in charge. Tax collectors were tarred and feathered, merchants accused of price gouging, men suspected of informing to the wrong authorities, men who had broken unwritten rules that were enforced not through any formal system, but through the willingness of enough people to participate in the consequence. The act required no proof. Only enough people willing to participate, and in a settlement where social pressure was one of the few forces that kept community life functional, participation in a tarring and feathering was sometimes as much about demonstrating alignment as about punishing the individual. But here's what nobody tells you. Removing hot tar from skin was agonizing. It had to be done with grease or oil, slowly, by hand. The burns underneath were often severe. Some men lost patches of skin entirely. Some developed infections that spread before anything could be done about them. Some died weeks later from wounds that nobody officially recorded as connected to what had been done to them. Their deaths went into the record as illness or accident or misfortune. The men who had poured the tar were at the table when the death was discussed. They said nothing that connected what they had done to what had happened. And, in most cases, nothing in the official record ever made that connection. Number 7, exile from the territory. A man is told to leave, not arrested. Not charged with anything specific, simply told by the men who hold power in that settlement that he has until sunrise to be gone. His belongings stay, his claim stays, his livestock stays, he takes what he can carry, and walks. This was called banishment, and it was used regularly, not just against criminals, but against men who were inconvenient. A miner who organized other miners to demand better pay. A farmer who refused to sell his land. A man who asked too many questions about where the community funds were going. A man who had witnessed something that powerful people needed him not to discuss. Banishment required no law, no judge, no written order, just enough armed men standing behind the person delivering the message. And if the man came back, the next conversation was shorter. And it didn't end with him walking anywhere. The threat of return was sometimes managed in advance. A man who had been banished and who was known to be stubborn received a different kind of message when he left. Not just the instruction to go, but a clear communication about what would happen if the instruction was ignored. That communication was delivered in terms that left no ambiguity by men whose history made the communication credible. Most men who were banished didn't come back, not because the instruction had persuaded them, because the calculation of what return would cost was clear, and most men, faced with that calculation, chose to begin again somewhere else. Number 8. Forced labor in private camps. Not all labor sentences went to public works. Some went directly to private operations, mines, ranches, timber camps, where the owner had an arrangement with the local authority. A convicted man was handed over and put to work. The owner provided food and shelter, which he charged against the man's sentence. By the time the sentence was served, the man often owed more than he started with. This system had a name in some places and no name in others. Either way, it functioned the same. A man entered with a 30-day sentence and left, if he left, with debt that tied him to the same place for months more. The food and shelter that the owner charged for were not the food and shelter that a free man would have chosen. A bunk in a structure that was cold in winter and stifling in summer. Meals calibrated to maintain work capacity, not to provide adequate nutrition for a grown man doing heavy labor. The charges for these provisions were set by the owner, not negotiated, and were applied whether the man found them acceptable or not. It gets worse. Injuries were common. The work was physically demanding. The safety provisions were minimal, and the pace was set by men whose financial interest was in maximum output. A man who broke his hand in a mine still worked the next day or lost his food ration. A man who lost his food ration for 2 days while injured came back to work because the alternative was worse. The men who ran these private labor operations were not anomalies. They were participants in a system that the territorial government had created and that the financial interests of the territory actively maintained. The arrangement benefited everyone in authority. The only people that didn't benefit were the ones doing the work. Number 9. Water punishment. Simple, brutal, effective. A man is bound and placed where water drips, slowly, steadily, onto one spot on his body, usually the forehead. Not enough to drown, just enough to make him feel after an hour like the water weighs 100 pounds. The sensation is difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. Each drop is individually nothing. Collectively, they become a kind of noise that occupies the entire mind. A man who can tolerate considerable physical pain often cannot tolerate this, not because it causes injury, but because it doesn't stop, and because the anticipation of each drop becomes as difficult as the drop itself. This was used not primarily as a sentence, but as a method of extracting information. Who else was involved? Where the money was? Who put him up to it? The men doing the questioning kept records of the answers. The man tied down kept hoping the water would stop. It usually did. Eventually, after the information that was wanted had been provided. Whether that information was accurate was a separate question. Under extended water drip, a man told his interrogators what they seemed to want to hear, because that was the fastest path to the water stopping. The accuracy of what he told them was often secondary to the telling of it. The men who received the information knew this, at least abstractly. They also knew that the information gave them something to act on, true or not, and that acting on false information was someone else's problem to sort out. Number 10. Being sold into indentured service, a man without money to pay a fine had two options in many territories: work off the debt in jail, which was often a hole in the ground with a grate over the top, or be contracted out to whoever offered to pay the fine on his behalf. That person then owned the man's labor for whatever period was agreed. The agreements were not always fair. The periods were not always honored, and the man in question had no legal standing to contest either. The contract had been signed by the man paying the fine and the territorial authority. The man whose labor was being contracted had no legal position in the transaction. He was its subject, not its party. Indentured service was technically different from slavery. In practice, the men living it often couldn't find the difference. They worked the same land for the same person, for as long as that person decided. They ate what was provided. They slept where they were told. They did not leave. When the agreed period ended, if it was honored, the man walked away with nothing more than he had arrived with, usually less. He had no savings, no references, and no time that belonged to him that he could use to build toward anything different. Some tried. Some found a way to something better. Most cycled back into the same systems, the same vagrancy laws, the same fine structure, the same arrangement that started the cycle over. Number 11. Solitary confinement in extreme conditions. The jails of the Wild West were not the jails people imagine from photographs. Many were dugouts, literal holes in the earth covered with timber and locked from above. No light, no ventilation worth mentioning. Summer temperatures inside reached extremes that caused men to lose consciousness. Winter temperatures caused frostbite. A sentence of 30 days in such a structure was not a minor inconvenience. It was a serious physical ordeal. The darkness was total. The silence was broken only by whatever sounds drifted from above, voices, animals, the movement of the settlement going on without the man below. He heard it, but could not see it, could not participate in it, could not be certain how much time had passed. Men came out thinner, slower, and sometimes not entirely present in the way they had been before they went in. The experience of extended darkness and isolation had effects on the mind that the era didn't have language for, and that the authorities didn't have interest in documenting. The authorities who sentenced men to these conditions knew what they were sentencing them to. That was the point. The dugout was not incidentally miserable. It was designed to be miserable. Misery was the sentence, and the structure delivered it efficiently. Number 12. Mutilation as punishment. The removal of a finger, an ear. In extreme cases, more. This was practiced more widely than official records suggest, particularly in areas where formal law was absent and informal authority was absolute. A man convicted of repeated theft might lose the finger he used to take things. The logic was direct. The execution was carried out without anesthetic and often without any medical care afterward. A knife, quickly. The stump bandaged if someone thought to do it. The man returned to the community with the mark of what had been decided about him visible on his body for the rest of his life. Infection was common. The conditions under which the removal was performed outdoors, in whatever space was available, with whatever implements were at hand, were not the conditions of a surgical procedure. Death from infection weeks later was not uncommon. It was rarely connected in any official record to the punishment that had caused it. The community watched. The community approved. The community told the story for years afterward as an example of how order was maintained. It became part of the local history, the account of the time when justice was served, the man's name, his own version of events, the possibility that the accusation had been wrong. These were not part of the story that got told. But here's the problem. The same community rarely asked who decided what counted as the offense, or who had brought the accusation, or whether anyone had bothered to verify the accusation before the knife came out. The verdict and the punishment came from the same source, without any separation between the one who accused and the one who decided, and without any process that protected the accused from either. Number 13, death by exposure as a sentence. A man is taken out into the desert. His boots are removed. His water is taken. He is pointed in a direction and told to walk. This is not described in official records as an execution. It is described as release. The legal distinction is real, technically. A man who is released is not being executed. What happens to him afterward is a matter of circumstances, the weather, the terrain, his own physical condition, the distance to the nearest water or shelter. None of these are the releasing authority's responsibility. They have released him. What he does with his freedom is his concern. This happened not once, not in one place. It happened in different territories, in different decades, carried out by different groups who all arrived at the same conclusion that leaving a man in the desert without water was technically not killing him. The desert disagreed, and the men doing the releasing understood what the desert thought, which was why they chose the desert and not some other direction. Number 14, punishment by proxy. A man commits an offense. The men in power cannot reach him. He has fled, or he is protected by someone more powerful. So they find the next closest thing, his brother, his neighbor, the man who sold him supplies last week, the family that had provided him shelter. Punishment by proxy was not official policy. It was not written into any code, but it happened, and it worked, because everyone in a small settlement understood that if you were connected to someone who caused trouble, you might pay for it. The effect was calculated. It kept people from helping each other. A man who might have provided shelter to someone fleeing an authority he knew was unjust thought twice, because the cost wasn't only his to bear. His family bore it. His neighbors bore it. The people connected to him bore it. This kept people from helping each other. That was the point. Isolation was easier to control than community. A man who stood alone against authority was manageable. A network of people who supported each other was not. Punishment by proxy was a tool for preventing networks from forming. Number 15. The wooden horse. A man is made to sit astride a narrow wooden beam, like a sawhorse, but elevated, with the sharp edge pointing up. His legs hang on either side. Weights are sometimes attached to his feet to increase the pressure. He sits there for hours. The wooden horse caused serious injury to the groin and inner thighs. Extended sessions caused lasting damage that did not heal fully. It was used primarily as a military punishment in frontier forts, a legacy of older military traditions brought west, but it spread into civilian use in some territories. A man on the wooden horse made no sound that helped his situation. Crying out brought nothing. The men positioned around him were there as witnesses, not as people who might intervene. The time was set before he got on, and the time was what it was. The men who designed it understood exactly what it did. That was not an accident. Number 16. Burning of property as collective punishment. A settlement is suspected of harboring someone who has committed an offense against a powerful interest, a railroad company, a land syndicate, a territorial authority. The men who represent that interest ride in. They do not find who they are looking for, so they burn the barn. They burn the storehouse, sometimes the house. Not because burning the property serves any investigative purpose, because burning the property sends a message to every person in the settlement about what association with the wrong people costs. And because the people they are sending the message to have no legal recourse. This was not legal under any formal code. It happened anyway. The men who did it rode away. The territorial authority looked at the report, noted the incident, and filed it. Nobody followed the men who had done the burning. Nobody charged them. Nobody compensated the people whose structures now existed only as ash. The settlers who lost everything rebuilt if they could. Many couldn't. They left, which, in many cases, was the intended outcome. The land they had been farming became available. Someone with resources was usually ready to acquire it. Number 17. Psychological punishment by public declaration. A man is accused, not convicted, not tried, simply accused, and the accusation is read aloud in the town's main gathering point. His name, the accusation, the name of whoever brought the charge, nothing else, no evidence presented, no defense permitted. From that moment, the man exists differently in the settlement. People cross the street. The merchant extends less credit. The landlord finds reasons to end the arrangement. His children are treated differently in whatever passed for school. The social fabric that had been part of his daily life is pulled back from him, not suddenly, but steadily, in 100 small interactions that individually could be attributed to something else, but collectively constitute a kind of exile that leaves the body in place while removing everything that made the place livable. He has not been physically touched, he has not been fined or imprisoned, but his life in that place is effectively over. This form of punishment cost the authority nothing. It required no infrastructure, no guards, no resources. It simply required a willingness to speak a name in public and let the community do the rest. And communities always did the rest. That was the most efficient thing about it. The authority provided the spark. The community provided everything else. The man who had been named sat in the center of the consequences and could not point to any single act against him, only to the accumulation. The Wild West was not lawless. That is the myth. The reality is that it had law, just not the kind that protected everyone equally. It had punishment, just not the kind that required proof. It had order, just not the kind that served the people living under it. The men who built those systems knew exactly what they were building. They built systems that could be used against the powerless and defended as legitimate. They built systems where the accused had no standing and the accuser had no accountability. They built systems where punishment could be applied without process, without appeal, and without consequence for the people applying it. And they built them to last. There is something worth sitting with in that fact. These 17 punishments were not the result of chaos. They were not the product of a world without rules. They were the rules, legal rules, accepted rules, rules that the community had, either explicitly or through silence, agreed to live under. Rules that served specific people and crushed others, and that were maintained precisely because the people they served had the power to maintain them, and the people they crushed did not have the power to challenge them. A man who was flogged at the wagon wheel was flogged because someone in that camp had decided that flogging was a legitimate response to the offense. No court ruled on it. No outside authority checked the decision. The man with the strap made the call, and the camp continued, and by the next morning, everything was back to what it had been before, except for the man who had been against the wheel. A man who was tarred and feathered on the main street of a settlement was tarred and feathered because enough people participated, and participation required nothing more than presence. The men who held him down had walked into town that morning with no particular plan. They left with the memory of what they had been part of. Most of them never thought about it again. Some of them, in later years, when they told the story, told it as something that had simply happened, as if the action had occurred without actors. A man who was sent into the desert without water was sent by men who had made a decision. They did not call it an execution. They called it a release. And they went back to their settlement and their dinner and their ordinary evening, and the man they had released walked into the heat until he couldn't walk anymore, and the desert did what deserts do. These are not old stories. They are not distant in the way that distance usually makes things feel smaller. They happened in the same landscape that people still drive through, still farm, still build houses on. The ground remembers things that the records don't. The tools changed as the territories became states, as formal law replaced informal authority, as the frontier became something with institutions attached to it. But the underlying logic that power defines what punishment is legitimate, and that the legitimate punishment is whatever power decides it is, that didn't change as fast as the structures around it. Understanding that is not comfortable, but it is accurate, and accurate is what this channel is about. If any of this surprised you, if any part of what you just heard was not what you expected, ask yourself why. What version of this history were you given instead? What did that version leave out? And who benefited from the leaving out? Leave your answer in the comments. We read them. And if this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. Because there is a great deal more where this came from. The frontier is larger than the myth, and most of what it contains has not been told the way it deserves to be told.